Good afternoon. I'm Martin Graebe and this is Shan.
Hello, everybody.
Today we're going to talk to you about Sabine Baring-Gould and particularly about his work with collecting songs in Devon and Cornwall. I'm going to talk for about 50 minutes and there will be a presentation which I'll start now. I'd like to start by inviting you to join me on a journey through space and time. I'd like you to imagine yourself in the southwest of England on a January day in 1890, and that you can feel the cold, damp air of Dartmoor that surrounds you. Dogs bark as two men, wrapped up in overcoats and hats against the wintry weather, approach a lonely cottage and knock at the door. After a brief conversation, the man who lives there invites them in. Follow them into the cottage and you'll see, as they loosen their clothing, that the younger of the two men is something of a dandy, reaching down to brush at the specks of farmyard mud on his lavender-coloured trousers. The other man is in his 50s, tall and imposing, dressed as a clergyman. The man whose home they're visiting is of a different kind, though in his own world he is the master. The more men who take a living from Dartmoor win it with great effort and with great skill, and the man, though respectful to his visitors, speaks to them with confidence. They settle round the fire, the young man sitting himself on a cider barrel after having dusted it with his handkerchief, and they take out notebooks. The conversation grows earnest, and then there is a pause as the moorman seems to gather himself before, with his eyes closed and his head thrown back, he begins to sing. Maybe it's something like, "Come all you young fellows that carry a gun, beware of late shooting when daylight is done. For it's little you reckon what hazards you run. I shot my own true love at the setting of the sun." The older gentleman smiles before he bends his head and his pencil begins to move, recording the words that he hears. The young man is also writing, recording the tune on lined paper. This continues for another hour or so, song following song, the moorman digging deep into his memory before time runs out and the two visitors leave as the light begins to fade. They walk the 5 miles to the little moorland tavern, the warmth of the log fire in the parlour, and an evening when they hope that other moormen and farmers will come to the Saracen's Head for an evening's entertainment, which will yield another crop of the old Devonshire songs that they're seeking. The younger man was Frederick Bussell, an Oxford graduate and lecturer, who will meet again shortly. And the clergyman was Sabine Baring-Gould, the squire and parson of Lew Trenchard in West Devon. Today I'm going to give you a glimpse of Sabine Baring-Gould's life, but I'll focus on the remarkable collaborative project that gave us this amazing collection of the songs of Devon and Cornwall. Sabine Baring-Gould was born in Exeter in 1834. He lived during the reign of 4 monarchs and graduated from having been carried in a sedan chair as a boy to riding in a motor car in his old age. He defied convention in his career as a churchman by his refusal to toe the line in church politics, and also in his choice of a wife, by marrying a teenage mill girl half his age with whom he had 15 children. He was a man of many interests. The public of his time knew him best as a writer and as one of the top 10 novelists at the end of the 19th century. His bibliography lists over 1,200 publications. On his 80th birthday, A newspaper columnist described him as unquestionably the most popular of living hymn writers. He received awards from 3 learned societies for his work as an archaeologist, and the only field in which he won no recognition was in his day job as a churchman. But then he did publish some home truths about his senior colleagues. His own view was that the greatest achievement of his life was the collection of folk songs that he made in Devon and Cornwall. His discovery of the Norse sagas at the age of 9 had a big influence on him, and in his 20s he undertook a pioneering expedition to Iceland to see the land in which the sagas were set and to write a book about them. This led him to further studies in European folklore. He collected tales, riddles, and a few songs when he was a curate in Yorkshire, and they provided fuel for more books, including important contributions to William Henderson's Folklore of the Northern Counties. Baring-Gould inherited the family estate at Lew Trenchard in Devon, and moved there to become both squire and parson in 1881. And there he remained until his death a few days short of his 90th birthday in 1924. Baring-Gould was 54 when he began collecting folk songs. He was a man who had a wide circle of friends. On an evening in 1888, the group round the table were all men who lived in West Devon, and though most were successful, they'd won their success through their own efforts. Their host was Daniel Radford, a man whom Baring-Gould held to be one of his best friends, whose wealth had come from recognising the opportunity for shipping Welsh coal to London at a time when the city was growing rapidly. The conversation turned to the old songs that they'd heard when they were younger. Songs like The Oxen Ploughing, Green Broom, and, of course, Widdicombe Fair. Baring-Gould told them that when he was a teenager, he'd heard men singing songs in the Dartmoor pubs that he'd stayed in. It was suggested that he was the right person to make a collection of the old songs that they'd loved. And I think that this should be remembered when you hear people talk of appropriation of folk songs from a lower class for personal glory or profit. These men felt that the songs were as much their own as anyone else's. Baring-Gould records that he took the decision to make the collection the following day, and after a period of thinking and planning, moved into action in September 1888. He wrote a letter to the editor of the Western Morning News, in which he asked people to send him the words and tunes of any old West Country songs that they remembered. I've highlighted the sentence on the slide in red, because it's important to remember that the idea of collecting English songs was, then, a pretty unusual, even radical one. He reported that, as a result of his letter, he was deluged with versions of Widdicombe Fair. He had, though, given examples of songs he was particularly keen to find. One of these was Sweet Nightingale, which he'd seen in Bell's Ancient Poems, Ballads and Songs of the Peasantry of England, published in 1857. The song had been heard from Cornish miners working in Germany, and Baring-Gould wondered if the tune survived in Cornwall. Within 2 weeks he was able to report that Edward Stevens of St Ives had sent him the tune as he remembered it. That tune, with the words taken from Bell's book, is now one of the best known of Cornish songs, mainly because Baring-Gould published it. It's since been republished many times, and has been translated into Cornish. When Baring-Gould looked further into its origins, he discovered that the song was derived from one written by Isaac Bickerstaff in 1760 for the ballad opera Thomas and Sally, and set to music by Thomas Arne. This is a good example of how a song from an 18th century stage show made its way into the folk tradition. The tune, composed by Arne, is completely different to that Edward Stevens gave to Baring-Gould. The old singers were skilled at adapting songs to a tune that they knew or made up. The text is also different, but key phrases and ideas in the text are the same. So let's sing The Sweet Nightingale for you. My sweetheart, come along, don't you hear the fond song? The sweet notes of the nightingale flow. Don't you hear the fond tale of the sweet nightingale as she sings in the valley below? As she sings in the valley below. Pretty Betty, don't fail, for I'll carry your pail safe home to your cot as we go. You shall hear the fond tale of the sweet nightingale as she sings in the valley below. As she sings in the valley below. Pray let me alone, I have hands of my own, and along with you, sir, I'll not go. For to hear the fond tale of the sweet nightingale as she sings in the valley below. As she sings in the valley below. Pray sit yourself down with me on the ground, on this bank where the primroses grow. You shall hear the fond tale of the sweet nightingale as she sings in the valley below. As she sings in the valley below. This couple agreed to be married with speed, and soon to the church they did go. Nevermore she's afraid for to walk in the shade as she sings in the valley below. As she sings in the valley below. It was also in the autumn of 1888 that Baring-Gould identified some local singers and invited them to his home to sing for them. One of these was James Parsons, a farm worker then aged 58, from whom he collected several songs over the years until his death in 1900. This photo of the hall at Loo House, taken in about 1894, shows how the room was arranged. James Parsons would have sat on the settle by the fire, with a mug of beer at his elbow, and Baring-Gould opposite him. After a little small talk, they turned to songs, and Parsons sang to Baring-Gould, who noted the words and the tune, occasionally going to the piano in the next room to play over what he'd written and check with the singer that it sounded right. Parsons reported that he was nervous at first, but that he came to enjoy their sessions together. And Baring-Gould wrote, "He was very strict with me, and insisted on my taking down his airs correctly. 'Vicky wouldn't do,' he would say. 'You've gotten that note not right. You mun know that I'm the master and you'm the scholar, and I won't have any slurs or blunders. What's right is right, and what's wrong never can be right to the world's end.'" Parsons came from a family of singers, the most famous of whom was his father, John Parsons, known as the singing machine because he could sing on for hours without repeating himself, provided that he was wound up with a few drops of beer. Singing was a family business, and Parsons, with his father, mother, and wife, would go to the crossroads in the village on a fine Saturday evening and sing songs in harmony. Jim's repertoire included a number of the favourite songs of the old rural singers, but he also sang several that, like Sweet Nightingale, had been written for the stage or the London pleasure gardens in the 18th century. He favoured the old tunes with the unusual scales, the old church modes, which made them feel strange, even uncomfortable to musicians of Baring-Gould's time who were not accustomed to them. When James Parsons died, Baring-Gould wrote the obituary that appeared in the Western Morning News. Parsons' fame spread further than that, however, and notices of his death appeared in newspapers in other parts of the country. The Hull Daily Mail lamented the loss of Devonshire's chief singing man and described him as a hedger by profession and a musician by nature. He was certainly an extraordinary man. Shan's going to sing you one of his songs, The Gown of Green, a charmingly old-fashioned romance of the kind that Parsons enjoyed. The song is the descendant of a group of late 17th century broadsides, of which this is an example. It is much longer and much more explicit, and I'll leave it to Shan to explain the significance of the green gown.
In the days when whole families lived in small cottages, then young couples often did their courtship out of doors. So you can imagine that a young lady in a beautiful white dress being courted by her lover, there might be occasion when she'd lie down on the grass and her white gown might become rather green. My love and I were walking to view the meadows round, to gather golden buttercups that glittered on the ground. She turned her head and smiling said, some strangers here have been, or else some charming shepherdess has donned the gown of green. My love is tall and comely, and faultless is her face, and like the pretty roebuck, her every step is grace. A blossom she at budding, her age is scarce 16. She did consent to my intent to wear the gown of green. Oh, some to please their lovers will buy them toys and rings, and some will pluck them posies and other fading things. Let every lad who loves his lass do this, and 'twill be seen she'll follow you so fast and true that wears the gown of green. She'll follow you so fast and true that wears the gown of green.
Thank you, Shan. To expand his collection, Baring-Gould needed to spend time with the singers in their pubs and in their homes. He wasn't confident about his ability to note tunes in the field and recruited the help of two musicians who went out with him to note the tunes while he concentrated on the words of the songs. Frederick Bussell was a postgraduate student at Oxford, whose mother Mary lived in a house on Baring-Gould's estate where Bussell spent his vacations. He was something of a character who dressed extravagantly, but he was a very competent musician. Despite his acknowledged eccentricity, he went on to become a highly regarded teacher of philosophy and vice principal of Brasenose College. Baring-Gould reported in a letter to the American ballad scholar Francis Child that he tried to shield his young colleague from some of the more forthright folk songs. The other man, Henry Fleetwood Shepherd was a churchman and a very different personality. He'd courted controversy in Yorkshire when he supported the introduction of plainsong into high church services, and he had a considerable knowledge of musical history. He was less frequently available to go out with Baring-Gould, but was the musical editor for the books of songs and arranged many of them for performance in the concerts that Baring-Gould put on. Baring-Gould's ability to note tunes has often been underestimated. There were a number of occasions when neither man was available to go out with him. He certainly preferred to collect songs where a piano was available, but his level of skill at noting tunes in the field improved with experience, and a high proportion of the songs in the collection were noted by him alone. Baring-Gould now started to make regular expeditions into the area around his home. Often he was driven by his coachman, Charlie Dustin. Otherwise he'd drive himself and his companion in his dog-cart. Each of the small triangles on this map represents a singer, and the circle marks a 25-mile radius, the distance that it was practical to travel out and back with horse and carriage in a day. A high proportion of the singers were on Dartmoor, partly because Baring-Gould enjoyed being on the moor, but also because he felt that the songs were more likely to have survived in the isolated moorland communities. He'd announced his intention to publish a book to be called Songs of the West in a letter to the Western Morning News dated 7th of December 1888. It would, he said, be issued in 3 parts, though this was later increased to 4. Remarkably, the first part was in the hands of a reviewer in February 1889, less than 6 weeks later. The 4th, concluding part was published in 1891, and a single-volume edition later that same year. These sold in relatively small numbers, but a new cheap edition, for which Cecil Sharp was the musical editor, was published in 1905 and sold well. Baring-Gould published 2 other books of songs, A Garland of Country Songs and the often undervalued 8-volume English Minstrelsy. He also co-edited English Folk Songs for Schools with Cecil Sharp, and these books made over 200 traditional songs available to the public. Baring-Gould has been repeatedly, and in some cases justly, criticised for his editing of the songs in his published work. Anticipating this criticism, he committed as early as December 1888 to ensuring that the original versions of the songs he'd heard were kept for the benefit of future scholars. He promised that he would put copies of the songs as he'd originally heard them in the public library in Plymouth, a far-sighted promise matched by few other song collectors of his time. Only a few people made the journey to Plymouth to look at the manuscripts, and opinions of Baring-Gould's work were mainly formed on the basis of his publications. The singer Cyril Tawney was a notable exception, and a great champion of Baring-Gould's song collection. Then, in 1992, a previously unrecognised hoard of manuscript material was discovered at Killerton House, east of Exeter. Several thousand books from Baring-Gould's personal library had been lent to the National Trust in the 1970s to fill the empty shelves in the library there. Among the books we discovered the huge 3-volume personal copy manuscript, which was Baring-Gould's primary record of the songs he had collected. This and other new material has made it possible to understand Baring-Gould's work with folk songs much better, and has occupied much of my time since, and of course provided the material for this talk and for my book about Baring-Gould. I'm not today going to talk about the manuscript collection in detail, but this slide summarises the various items. All of these manuscripts are in archives and libraries in Devon, with the exception of the book of correspondence with Francis Child. Most are on permanent loan from the Baring-Gould family, who've been very supportive of our efforts to understand their ancestors' work. As a result of projects involving the English Folk Dance and Song Society and Wren Music, most of Baring-Gould's folk song manuscripts are now available online as part of the Vaughan Williams Memorial Library's digital archive. Hundreds of singers and other informants were involved in the supply of songs to Baring-Gould's collection. Quite early in the project, I started to build a database of the singers as I came across them, and I now have a list of more than 200 people named as singers by Baring-Gould. Using the census and other public documents, as well as newspaper accounts, I've been able to establish the identity of most of these singers, found out where they lived and what they did for a living. Occasionally, I've been able to find living descendants who've told me stories about their ancestor, and I have been given a few photographs. Baring-Gould was interested in people of all sorts and recorded details and anecdotes about them. Many of these details were included in his published notes to the songs, and stories about some of the singers appear in his books and articles. Though he frequently uses pseudonyms, it's sometimes possible for a diligent detective to identify the person being described. The level and quality of information that he recorded about his singers is much better than the majority of other collectors. Let me give you an example. I've written about several of Baring-Gould's singers in my book, so rather than repeat a description you can read there, let me talk about William Houghton, who received only a brief mention. Here's a page from the 1891 census, and I've pulled out the information for the household of William Houghton, who's identified as an 85-year-old farmer living in Charlestown, Cornwall. Baring-Gould described how in August 1894 he and Frederick Bassell spent an evening at Charlestown with some of the old seamen, hoping to collect songs from them. And one of them was Houghton, who, as well as being a farmer, was the assistant dock gatekeeper there. Baring-Gould wrote, "At Charlestown, near St Austell, is a very old but hearty man who was once a noted smuggler. He was in prison for smuggling the year that William IV was crowned, and he's now harbour master. We went after him, got him to come and have an early dinner with us, and then he yarned away over old smuggling experiences and sang us a number of very curious old songs." Houghton was also mentioned in an article that Baring-Gould wrote for Cassell's family magazine, The Last of the Smugglers, in which he was given the alias of Wisdom Penaluna. He'd served a year in prison in 1830 when he was caught smuggling, but he'd long since given up the trade, or so he said. He described his life as a smuggler with some pride, telling Baring-Gould about the profits that he'd made. He carried Holland's gin and tobacco, but said that tea was the most profitable cargo, since they could buy it at 7p a pound and sell it for 8 shillings, 14 times what they'd paid for it. He told Baring-Gould, "The worst of it was we had to do with informers. The government, they had spies everywhere. They had spies in France, they had spies on our own Cornish coast. More shame to Cornishmen for doing the dirty work, but, bless you, sir, there always be tares among the wheat. We're told that in Scripture." William Houghton gave Baring-Gould 8 songs, one of which Shan's going to sing for you, The Complaining Maid.
'Twas on a summer morning, just as the sun was rising, there did I hear a maiden complain. She fancy, love, it is a fancy. Sweethearts and lovers are torments of pain. Down in yonder bower there does grow a flower. Do you remember vows you made there? Go to, false pretender, do you not remember how you my innocent heart did ensnare? Young men are deceivers, young women believers. Young men are false and seldom prove true. They're roving and ranging, their minds always changing, and seeking for some object that's new. Oh, had I my own heart in keeping, oh, if I had my heart back again, close in my bosom, I treasure it sleeping, never to wake to such exquisite pain.
Baring-Gould gave that song the title The Complaining Maid, but you may have come across a very similar song, "'Twas on one April morning." 'Twas on one April morning, just as the sun was rising. 'Twas on one April morning, I heard the small birds sing. They were singing, "Lovely Nancy, for love it is a fancy." So sweet were the notes that I heard the small birds sing. That's one of the loveliest of English folk songs, and was heard at Cowley, just outside Exeter, from a railway worker, Richard Bryant, by Priscilla Wyatt Edgell. Now, she was a friend of the Baring-Gould family who lived at Cowley Manor and collected a number of songs, some of which she sent to Baring-Gould, though not this one. Cecil Sharp collected a similar first verse in Somerset, but these were the only known versions of the song until we discovered The Complaining Maid in Baring-Gould's manuscripts. There's actually a fragment of another version, which Baring-Gould had heard 3 years earlier from Mary Gilbert at Morgan in Pida, also in Cornwall. The songs clearly have a common ancestor, probably another from an 18th century stage show, but it has yet to be discovered. Baring-Gould only met William Houghton on one occasion, but he provided the material for several thousand words in various publications. He seems to have had a weakness for old reprobates like Houghton. Many of his singers had led less than exemplary lives, but his affection for them was genuine and unforced. As he said in a letter to Lucy Broadwood, "The singing birds are not, I'm sorry to say, a very respectable lot, but I love them, and I'm sure they love me." One of the revelations of the work that I've done on Baring-Gould was the extent to which he engaged with contemporary folk song collectors, including William Barrett, Francis Child, Lucy Broadwood, Frank Kidson, George Gardner, Ralph Vaughan Williams, Anne Gilchrist, and particularly Cecil Sharp. He exchanged letters with them, and some visited Lou Trenchard to look at his collection and exchange ideas with him. I thought you might like to see what some of them said about their stays with Baring-Gould. An early visitor to Lou House was Marianne Mason, who'd published a collection of folk songs in 1877, many of which she learned as a child. She was the first English woman to collect and publish folk songs. I find it hard to resist including this picture of her because she looks so magnificent in that hat. She was planning to republish her collection with extra material, but her busy working life as a senior civil servant, the first woman to achieve such a position, prevented her from doing so. Baring-Gould took Lucy Broadwood out with him to collect songs in the area around Lou Trenchard, and they also met in London a few times, and Broadwood helped Baring-Gould by looking for items in the British Museum reading room and by helping him make sense of some of the tunes that he'd collected. A large number of letters from him are in Broadwood's papers. In the early 1890s, there was some distrust between Frank Kidston and Baring-Gould, each criticising the other's collection. The criticism wasn't public, but appeared in letters that each wrote to Lucy Broadwood, who, it appears, was encouraging them in these views, possibly mischievously rather than maliciously. Things changed when Baring-Gould stayed with Kidston in 1894 in Leeds. After that, the two men became friends, and in Baring-Gould's mammoth compilation English Minstrelsy, Kidston was praised for his help in giving him valuable hints relative to the history of some of the songs. Kidston stayed at Lou Trenchard in 1911 and wrote a lengthy article about his visit for the Yorkshire Weekly Post. Of the visitors to Lou House, the one who came most frequently was Cecil Sharp. He'd used songs from Baring-Gould's book in his Book of British Song in 1902, and when he started to collect folk songs in the following year, he wrote to Baring-Gould asking to meet up with him. They didn't actually get together until the spring of 1904, and by that time Algernon and Methuen, the publisher of Songs of the West, had had the happy idea that Sharp might be the right person to take on the role of musical editor for a new edition of the collection. This proved successful, as did their subsequent joint publication, English Folk Songs for Schools. Baring-Gould was a strong influence on Sharp, and the latter's English Folk Song Some Conclusions was dedicated to Baring-Gould. Sharp also took the opportunity to collect songs when he visited Lou Trenchard. Most of Baring-Gould's old singers were dead by then, but he was able to meet John Dingle, who lived nearby. Sharp took this lovely photo of Dingle with his wife Elizabeth and collected some songs from them. One of these was Come All Ye Worthy Christians, a robust religious song, well suited to the tune which has been used for popular songs of all kinds since at least the early 18th century. Come all you worthy Christians that dwell within this land, don't spend your time in rioting, recollect you are but a man. Be watchful of your latter and be ready when you're called. There is many changes in this world, some rise and some do fall. See Job, he was a patient man and a rich man in the East. And when he was brought to poverty, his sorrow did increase. He bore it all most patiently, no sin did he repine. He always trusted in the Lord and soon got rich again. Come all you worthy Christians that are so very poor, Remember how poor Lazarus lay at the rich man's door, a-begging for the crumbs of bread which from his table fell. The scripture now informs us all, in heaven he doth dwell. So poor I am contented, no riches do I crave, for all things are but vanity on this side of the grave. There is many roll in riches, their glasses will run out. No riches we brought into this world, and none can carry out. The time then it will come, when parted us must be. The only difference then remains to joy or misery. We all must give a strict account, the great as well as small. So recollect, my people, one God will judge us all. We all must give a strict account, the great as well as small. So recollect, my people, one God will judge us all. Baring-Gould's song collection as it stands contains approaching 2,000 songs. I'm still working to establish the exact number, as his rough copy manuscript containing about 1,000 tunes still needs detailed exploration. Many of the songs do not appear in the collection of others working at around the same time. Baring-Gould, like all of his contemporaries, was selective in what he recorded. He had to be. He and his colleagues had invested time, effort, and often some personal discomfort in their search for traditional songs, and they didn't want to waste precious time on accumulating material that didn't help their cause. He made it clear that he didn't like the popular music from American minstrelsy, the parlour or the music halls, but he did note some of the songs from his singers, though he didn't publish them. Baring-Gould's most prolific singer was Samuel Fone of Mary Tavy. He visited him at least 15 times, and his manuscripts identify 124 songs that he sang, though there are clear indications that he knew many more. Sam's repertoire contained a wide variety of songs, and he told Baring-Gould who his sources were for many of them. As a child, he learnt songs from his mother and father, and also from an old woman, Anne Gomer, to whom he delivered milk, for which she paid him with songs because she had little money. As a young man, he learnt further songs from workmates and in pub sessions. His father's favourite song was Arthur le Bride, while one of his mother's songs was Lady Isabella's Tragedy, which he said had been sung to him when he was a child at her knee. The ballad tells how Lady Isabella has her chef kill her stepdaughter and bake her in a pie which is then served to her father. Luckily, as he opens his mouth to take the first bite, a faithful kitchen boy speaks up to gain rapid promotion, and stepmother and cook meet a fiery end. It's a great story, but is it one for a mother to sing to the child at her knee? Similar questions of taste arise with another of Sam's songs, A Lady in the West, which he says he sang to his wife Elizabeth when they were courting. He told Baring-Gould that, "When I was a-courting her, as now be my missus, I reckon that be 33 years gone, her used to sit on a bank, and I singed her this song over and over. Her loved it dearly." Now, this ballad, probably from a broadside, tells of a young woman whose father is so upset when she says that she's fallen in love with his clerk that he picks up a gun, which just happens to be nearby, and shoots her dead. Struck with remorse, he then cuts his throat with a likewise handy razor. The clerk comes in, sees the slaughter, and kills himself with his penknife, falling on his true love's body. Sam's younger sister Charlotte also sang, as he reports that they made a 3-day journey to London in a carrier's cart when he was a lad, and that all the way up, day by day and hour by hour, she sang 17 on Sunday. Not, as Baring-Gould said, quite such a song as one would expect from a child. Much better a good murder, perhaps. Baring-Gould recognised that if he was to get people interested in folk songs, they needed to hear them sung. In an age before radio, this meant they must be performed in public, and the way in which he set out to get the songs performed is quite remarkable. In January 1889, he gave a short series of lectures on Devonshire songs and ballads, and the lectures included examples of songs performed by a small group of semi-professional musicians recruited locally. He sang 2 of the examples himself. The events were judged a success, and he planned a series of concerts in the following autumn. You can see from the invitation card sent to friends and notables in the 2 counties that this was to be a concert lecture, with the songs presented in 6 scenes with scenery and costumes. Baring-Gould talked about the songs while the stage was being reset between the scenes. 2 further tours followed with a number of professional singers. Baring-Gould found it increasingly difficult to give up the time to be at the concerts himself, and so in 1893 Frank Pemberton took over the running of the concerts. He was an experienced theatrical performer and manager who'd met and married Mary Bassell, the sister of Frederick Bassell, who you will remember went out collecting songs with Baring-Gould. Frank Pemberton was given the freedom by Baring-Gould to adapt the Songs of the West costume concerts as he saw fit, and his simplified version of the show ran for more than 200 separate performances, including a tour of Canada and the USA. At the end of the First World War, Baring-Gould was 84 years old, and his health started to fail. His world became smaller, and he could no longer visit friends or walk on Dartmoor unless he could be driven. To his great sadness, he was no longer able to preach in his church, and he died early in the morning of the 2nd of January 1924. His funeral was a grand affair. The head of the procession, comprising 2 bishops, a host of clergymen and the family mourners, reached the church before the last mourners left the house. The coffin was carried by some of his tenants past the school children of the village who lined the route. The church couldn't hold everyone, so a large number gathered outside. His hymn, "Now the Day is Over," was sung before the coffin was carried to the open grave lined with moss and lilies, where he was laid to rest next to the woman he'd loved. There are no longer people living who knew him personally, but memories linger, and I've been told several stories about him. In West Devon, he's still a respected figure. He was kind to his parishioners and those who worked for him. There were little gifts for weddings and presents for Christmas, and often these would continue after the person had left Baring-Gould's service. In 1909, for example, Baring-Gould sent a postcard to Mrs. Sarah Ruddle at Loddiswell, telling her that he was sending her a goose for Christmas. She'd been the housekeeper at Loo House until she married George Ruddle, and moved with him when he took a job as a gamekeeper in South Devon. George Ruddle had worked as the gamekeeper on the Loo Trenchard estate, but he was also one of the bell ringers at St. Peter's Church. Tony Ruddle also sent me a copy of a photograph of the bell ringers, in which his grandfather is second from the right. Baring-Gould is standing in the centre, with his hands on the shoulders of 2 men, his son Julian on his left, and Charles Davy, who'd sent the photograph to Mrs. Ruddle. Davy was a carpenter on the Loo Trenchard estate and the churchwarden for 45 years. This is the only photograph I have in which Baring-Gould is smiling, clearly happy to be with his own people, at his own church, in the place that he loved above all others, Lou Trenchard. After all these years of work with him, I admire Baring-Gould's achievements enormously, though I often despair at his silly mistakes. He was a storyteller, and a good one, though sometimes he didn't let the facts stand in the way of a good story. He had the flexibility of mind that allowed him to put forward theories and to shrug his shoulders and move on if someone disproved them. He was a keen observer, with a broad vision that allowed him to see the big picture. But perhaps his greatest strength was his interest in people and his sympathy with them. This was reflected in his attitude to the singers that he met and his genuine affection for them. And it's also shown in the way he shared his knowledge with his fellow collectors and the networks that he built among them. It would be disingenuous of me not to say that there are still copies of my book available for sale, which will give you much more information about many of the things I've talked about. If you'd like to buy a copy, I can send it to you for £15, including postage. Drop me a line at the email address shown on the next slide, and I will make the necessary arrangements. Thank you for watching. We'll sing you a final song before we give you a chance to ask questions.
This song was sung by a very young boy who lived in Alton, and it was sung to him by his aunt, who was brought up in the workhouse at Lanson, and he used it as his nightly prayer.
My coffin shall be black, 4 little angels at my back, 2 to watch and 2 to pray, and 2 to carry my soul away. Ding, ding dong, the parson's bell, very well, my mother. I shall be buried in the old churchyard, along with my dear mother. My coffin shall be black, 4 little angels at my back, 2 to watch and 2 to pray, and 2 to carry my soul away. When I am dead and in my grave, and all my bones are rotten, Jesus Christ will come again when I am quite forgotten. My coffin shall be black, 4 little angels at my back, 2 to watch and 2 to pray, and 2 to carry my soul away. My coffin shall be black, 4 little angels at my back, 2 to watch and 2 to pray, and 2 to carry my soul away. Thank you very much.